I know I'm a little bit late to the game, but it's not gonna stop me from voicing my opinions, guys. Come on.
That's my opinion!
As many people in the book talk world know, there has been a recent spike in fanfiction authors being given publishing deals so that they can rewrite some of their most famous fanfic works that got them popular in the first place. Specifically, within this pairing of Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger from Harry Potter universes, better known as the Dramione ship. This has led to a pretty wide discussion around the ethics or the morality of this pipeline of fanfic to trad pub books. And as we've talked about this, there have been varying discussions all the way from the legality of these things to just people's opinions on this and how they feel about specifically a lot of fanfiction that's coming from a universe that was written and created by a pretty problematic author. So I think there are some really great videos here on YouTube that really talk about the legality of republishing a book that was based off of a fanfiction, which means that it was based off of intellectual property that wasn't theirs. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, that's definitely something that's already widely available. I don't have much background with the legal system. It's also not something I was really interested in when I was thinking about this specific topic, because to me, if it wasn't legal, I just don't think it would have been able to happen so often to the point where people are popularizing these books based on the fact that they used to be fan fiction, or maybe there's a really major lawsuit coming soon, who knows. But to me, I didn't think that that is what was the crux of this conversation. I think there was a lot more to it, and so I wanted to talk about maybe how I felt about this pipeline specifically for these Dramione books. And so those are the books I'm going to be focusing on for today's video. I wanted to talk instead about some of the most popular books that have been traditionally published as rewrites of the original fanfictions, specifically from the Dramione universe, that have been marketed that way so that everybody knows that it's tied to the Harry Potter universe. And those 4 books that I'm going to be talking about are in the order that I read them. And again, these are the most famous ones. I know there are a few more that have kind of gone under the radar a little bit because they're more loosely inspired by the original fanfics. But the ones I'm going to be talking about today are The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy by Bridget Knightley, Rose in Chains by Julie Soto, Alchemised by Senlin Yu, and Once Again Always by Amanda Gale. Now, I will say Once Again Always is currently only available as an advanced reader copy or an ARC. I was fortunate enough to get it as an ARC, so I did read it right when I got approved for it because I was really excited for it. So I will be including my thoughts on that book, but I want to preface this by saying that I read it as an ARC version and the published version might be different. My review might not be as applicable to the published version if they change a ton of stuff. What I want to do is, one, give you a bit of a review of the book while we're going through it, but I also want to go through understanding how this pipeline is affecting the quality of books that we get, and whether there's more to this discussion than just, is it ethical for people to have this pipeline, or are we just getting really poorly written works that don't quite stand on their own outside of the universe that it was inspired in or based in originally? So that's the goal with this video, and then try to sum it up with a few of my thoughts on the pipeline itself. And again, I want to say, obviously this is highly subjective because these are my opinions on the books and these are my opinions on how I feel the traditionally published book version compared to the fanfic in most cases. So very subjective, but when has that ever stopped me from saying stuff? Let's get into it. The first book that we're going to talk about is called The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy. I don't think I can hide it when I give the review of this book, so I will just say this is my favorite book that has come out of this whole pipeline, and I am so glad that this pipeline gave Bridget Knightley the ability to become a published author. Such a good book. Such a good book. Where do I even start with this book? So this book is based off of the very popular fanfic called Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love. It is still up and available on AO3 or Archive of Our Own. The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy is different from the other books that I read to the best of my ability because this is the only book that isn't actually based on the fanfiction. And what I mean by that is that this book is not a direct rewrite of Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love, which is why it is still available on Archive of Our Own, because the fanfic and the traditionally published book don't have the same storyline. They aren't competing, which is why Bridget Knightley was able to keep that up online and people were still able to read that fanfiction, whereas all of the other fanfictions have been taken off of Archive of Our Own and are no longer available to be read because the books are direct rewrites of those fanfictions. To start, that is immediately what makes this book very different from the others. And I want to make this clear too, that when we're talking about the advertising of this book, it seemed like the marketing was saying that this was a direct rewrite of the fanfic that made Bridget Knightley popular on Archive of Our Own. Bridget Knightley, as an author, has been very clear to state that this book is not a rewrite, that it's almost like a love letter to Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love, but it is not by any means a rewrite. I would say with this book, the biggest similarities that you could find across these stories are that you have like an enemies to lovers arc, and you do have this morally gray, morally ambiguous male main character, and then you have this sort of really smart, uptight, proud sort of female main character, which obviously still map onto Draco and Hermione, and you can kind of see where that inspiration is still pulled in. But I would say that's about the limit of where you could say that these two stories, like the fanfic and the traditionally published book, are similar. But outside of that, the story is completely different. So we can get into that. So the original fanfiction, Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love, is set quite a few years after the ending of what we have in the Harry Potter universe. So after book 7, or after the movie 8 or whatever. I don't quite remember how many years are in between it, but it's a pretty decent amount of years. Draco Malfoy, he's like redeemed himself a little bit, or well, he's kind of almost completely redeemed himself. He works with Harry and with Ron, and he works as an R. Hermione is at a university in a teaching research career, and so she's made a ton of discoveries, obviously because she's a genius, and in this time she's made a discovery that is super life-changing and could be like one of the biggest scientific discoveries in the entire world. And as she's in the process of doing that, the ministry basically decides that she needs extra protection because of the sort of work that she's doing, that she's probably going to be targeted by people. And so they assign which R but Draco Malfoy to the case. So the entire story kind of focuses on Draco and Hermione as they get to know each other again, and as the new versions of themselves, through him trying to protect her and trying to make sure that he's actually there when she's like going out in public or like doing anything dangerous. And Hermione is trying her hardest to stay away from him because she's like, I don't need protection, I'm good, like I'm fine. And so she ends up going on a bunch of like different adventures and trying to collect a bunch of artifacts basically for her research. And so she has to go on some pretty wild adventures to do that. I think one of the key structures of this story is these magical escapades where they're just going on like the wildest adventures to be like, oh, we need to find the bone of this like legendary magical person, and they have to go and like find this bone or something, you know. And she's always trying to run away from Draco, and Draco's like, oh my god, you need protection. And so he like always finds her, and then they have to go on these little adventures together. And through these adventures they get to know each other a lot better, and they obviously kind of end up falling in love with each other. That's the overall story of Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love. It is a very unserious, very funny, witty, quirky sort of story, and I absolutely adored this fanfic. If you can't already tell, it was one of the first few fanfics that I read when I was getting into the Dramione world, because I was very much exclusively a Drarry girl before I got into Dramione. So any fanfic I read that was set in the Harry Potter universe was always Draco and Harry, and it was never anything else, because I was like, I'm pretty happy with everyone else's pairings. I will say I am not a Hermione and Ron hater. I will make this very clear. I don't quite like them in the movies together, but book Ron and book Hermione are literally one of my favorite couples ever, and like I don't understand people who say that they don't like them together, because I think that's absolutely bonkers, because he is literally so amazing to her in the books. Point being that this is one of the first few fanfics that I read, and it really got me into this ship, because it was just so fun and like so light and so fluffy, and it was just like so well written. In The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy, we do see a different plot line though. So we have our two main characters, Osric Osric and Oriane. Osric is our male main character, and he is part of this assassin order, which is basically different types of orders that you have that match with the sort of magic that you do. And then we have Oriane, who is part of this healer order, and so right from the start you see assassin and healer obviously aren't gonna get along. But anyways, so you have a bit of that enemies to lovers right there, right? The story starts with us finding out that Osric has this incurable disease that's basically killing his magic systems that he has in his body. And so once those magic systems are destroyed, he doesn't have any magic anymore, and he kind of basically becomes useless, right? And so he wants to do everything that he can to stop this disease from taking over, and he hopes against hope that he can find some sort of cure for this basically incurable disease as it stands right now. And so he gets told to ask one of the most famous healers, Oriane, to try to find a cure because he is literally desperate and will do anything. And so he kind of puts together this bribe that he'll use to get Oriane to do it, because obviously he's an assassin and she's obviously not going to want to do it. And so he says that he'll bribe her and he will pay her all of this money if she can just heal this for him. And she's like, first of all, I just can't heal this for you. Like, this is literally incurable. And he's like, oh, like, are you saying that you can't cure something? And she's like, oh, I didn't say that. You know, anyway, so there you have a bit of that teasing, unserious little interactions between them. And eventually Oriane says that, listen, I'll do it if you, instead of bribing me, if you give that money towards Pox research, which is basically research on this, as of right now, incurable pox disease that's just been killing tons of people, which doesn't have any funding because governments just don't care about it. She's like, if you provide funding for that research, I will do this work for you, even though you should know that like there is just no cure for this as of right now. And he's like, sure, whatever, man, I'll take anything. And so we kind of just follow them as Oriane tries to find different ways to heal Osric, and obviously things are just going as most of these diseases go. It just continues to get worse, and there's nothing that she can do that's gonna make it better. And eventually she's like, I don't know, like there's just no traditional healing that I can do. And he's like, okay, what about untraditional healing? Like what can we try? And she's like, well, you know, I don't really believe in it, but there's like this sort of stuff, like this sort of legend and folklore. And he's like, I literally don't care, do it, like try it. And so there are a ton of these wacky little tales basically that they have to try to follow in order to somehow find this sort of cure now, that's based off of folklore or like fairy tales and all this kind of stuff. And so they kind of have to go on a bunch of these little wacky adventures and try to find some sort of cure or some sort of help for Osric's disease. And so obviously through those little adventures that they go on, they kind of get closer, they get to know each other a little bit more, and something starts to spark between them. Duh. But also, as we're going through the story, there's a lot that they're finding out outside of just like the research that they're trying to do, because it seems like somehow both of their authors are kind of involved in something that is linked right now, and they feel like something really big is coming with this one specific order that just everybody hates. And so there's a lot of like political unrest and turmoil that's happening that both Osric and Oriane sort of find themselves involved in, and then they're like, wait, if you know information, I know information, maybe we can try to work together and see what happens. And so while they're, you know, trying to cure Osric, they're also finding out a ton of information about this pox outbreak specifically. And through all of that, there's a lot of like political games that are sort of uncovered, and so that becomes part of the story as well. And since this book is the first in a duology, it kind of ends obviously on a bit of a cliffhanger, but that's the plot of The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy. So as you can see, there are some similarities between these two stories, but they are not by any means a rewrite or kind of linked in any real substantial way. So I would say the things that are probably the most similar across these stories are the use of these funny little quickie adventures as drivers for their relationships and drivers for these main characters to get closer together. But outside of that, the actual plot of the two stories are quite different. Again, like I said, they have similarities in like hair colors or sort of their main characteristics, but that's about it. That's really where the similarity ends when you're looking at these two books. The fanfic There is a hint of like politics at play. Her research would be a risk to some organizations because it was like really, really life-changing research. But outside of that, there wasn't really anything political in nature in the original fanfic. But in this book, there is quite a large role of politics that are at play in terms of what they're finding out and how it kind of affects their relationship too, and how it affects all of the things that they're doing in their own orders. So there's a lot more world building that goes into this. It is set in a completely different world with different magic systems, with a different geography and all the sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, these books are fundamentally two different stories. The traditionally published book is not a rewrite of the fanfiction. I will also say probably one of the things that is most similar across these two books or across these two stories is the type of humor that Bridget Knightley uses, which makes sense because, you know, I mean, as the author, you're probably going to have a sense of writing that transfers from one project to the next. And so the sort of humor that's used in both of these books are pretty similar in that it's very banter focused, it's very quirky, dry kind of humor, and it's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. I loved it and I ate it up, but it did have similar humor across these stories, which I think as an author, you're going to have a style of writing that transfers and that translates over different projects. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think a lot of times that's what pulls you into an author, right? So it makes you like an author and their work. And so I don't think it's a problem for them to have similar sort of humor across these two projects. That's kind of like the end of similarities between these two books, right? Again, to stress, Bridget Knightley made it very clear that this book was separate from the fanfic in any of the advertising that they were doing. So it was very obvious on their social media, on any posts they were making, that this book was not a rewrite of the fanfiction. And again, that's made really clear by the fact that Bridget Knightley left up the original fanfic still available on Archive of Our Own so that people can still go and read it, which just further shows how much Knightley wanted to separate this from their original work and did not want to rewrite something that is already available for people to read and people have already read. They used this as an opportunity to create a completely different story and kind of make a name for themselves as an author without having to rewrite the book that made them popular on AO3. The marketing of Knightley as an author, however, was very closely tied to their roots in Dramione fanfic. And so I do want to go over a few points there, right? So one, I do know that authors don't always have full control over how their books are marketed. So I don't really know how much of this marketing was Knightley's idea or was the publisher's idea, right? When it comes to how closely related to the Harry Potter universe or to fanfic writing Knightley was marketed with. But regardless of that, I do think that to a certain extent it makes sense, right? Like, here's an author who's obviously created a very strong fan base on AO3 through writing fanfic, right? It makes sense that you want to leverage that support when you're traditionally publishing your first book. When you're publishing a book, you want to be a bestseller. You want to prove to a publishing house that you can do a good job and you can sell books and you can advertise these books, right? If you already have a pretty loyal following and you already have like one of the most popular fanfics in a specific ship, I think it makes sense to want to leverage the support that you have from that community, right? You want to leverage the loyal supporters and the loyal readers that you already have. And you want to be able to translate that into book sales and into stats that show that you're an author worth signing. You have some sort of worth to publishers, right? So I think if Knightley hadn't really stressed that they were a already famous, pretty popular author on AO3 in this specific niche, I don't know that they would have sold the sort of books that they did by putting it into their marketing, right? Like, I don't know that they would have had the same level of success, because why would people be paying attention to their books, right? The only way that people knew that Bridget Knightley was associated with Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love was because that was pulled into their marketing. That isn't the same handle that they used when they were writing their fanfics, right? So I would have no idea that Bridget Knightley is the same author who wrote this fanfic that I ended up really enjoying. So if that wasn't pulled into the marketing? How would I know that I would want to read Bridget Knightley's book? So I think it makes sense, because why would you not leverage a fan base that you already have, a fan base that will likely pay money to read your books that are traditionally published? And I think it makes sense for Knightley to have pulled that in, especially because this wasn't a rewrite of the fanfic. Because for Sun Lin Yu, for example, who used the same pen name that they used when they published or when they wrote this book on AO3, one, just by the name itself, you'd be able to tell that it's the same author, because they used the same pen name that they used on Archive of Our Own. But because it was a rewrite of this book, not only are they doing marketing on the front of like the publishing house, but they're also doing marketing on AO3 by saying, hey, I have to take down this copy of this book because I am publishing it, right? Like, you have this very clear sense of, I am now telling people who have read this book and who are still keeping up with this fanfic that I am now traditionally publishing this and you should buy this and I'm gonna make money off of this now. And so if Sun Lin Yu and if other authors that are rewriting their fanfics have a very clear message that's being sent to their followers saying that, hey, this is now going to be available for money and you should buy it, with Knightley leaving that up on AO3, there's no clear, easy way to tell people that, hey, by the way, I'm this author of this book and I'm publishing this book. You should go buy it, even though it isn't a rewrite of this fanfic. It almost becomes harder for Knightley to sell themselves as an author that's related to this platform and related to this fanfic, which is why it makes sense for them to tie into their marketing that they were actually this fanfic author. And if you liked that sort of writing and that sort of work, you should definitely buy their book, because this is now their entry into the publishing world as a published author, and you should read that book and you should read that story, and it's going to be a brand new story, so it's brand new content for you to consume and to read and to enjoy. So I think it makes sense that that was pulled into the marketing, and I think it probably makes even more sense for Knightley to do that because it wasn't a rewrite. I will also note that since, again, this was the only book that wasn't a rewrite of the fanfic, I think the book itself, the traditionally published book itself, sort of has a really nice distance to the Harry Potter universe already, right? There's already a natural sense of distinction between the problematic origins of the Harry Potter universe and this book. Yes, this author was able to do well because they had created a fan base in a fan fiction based website, but when you're creating works of fiction on websites like AO3 and fanfiction.net, you're not making money off of these things, right? Like, you're not actually benefiting from creating these stories. The only benefit is, one, as an author to either hone your writing skills, or two, just as creative to express a sort of story that you wish you could have seen, or to express a sort of, redemption arc or a different storyline that you wished you could have seen in an original work of fiction, or maybe not even fiction. I don't know, people are kind of wild, right? It's things that you just wish you could have seen as a creative person. You're not writing this to get some sort of compensation, right? Like, the only compensation you have is like intangible, you get engagement and you get people saying, wow, I love your story, and you get like following and you get things like that, but you don't actually earn anything off of these writings, right? I think when you're talking about these fan fictions, which I think I'll discuss a little bit more at the end of the video because we would have gone over some of the other fanfics, I think that the natural distance that's created between specifically the Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy and its inspirational fanfic counterpart, I think is good, because it just naturally creates a separation between these two worlds, because this is not a direct rewrite, which means that Bridget Knightley's first work that they're making money off of isn't actually that tied to the Harry Potter universe. I know it's easy to draw comparison between this book and the fanfic that they wrote, but I want to be really, really cognizant of the fact that the author was very clear that these books were not related in any way, right? That these two works were two completely different works of fiction. And so I want to keep that in mind when we're talking about this book, that it's very easy to compare authors' works to each other and to find parallels or to find inspiration between them or to find similarities and commonalities between these two books. But those are just natural things that happen when you're an author. When you're an author who writes specific tropes or who likes writing specific plot lines or specific specific arcs and who likes writing characters in a certain way, right? Or likes writing certain dynamics. That's going to happen across authors in general, right? So I do want to be very cognizant that it's very easy to compare these two works and say, yeah, sure, they still have similarities. But when Knightley is marketing these books and writing these books and saying that they're two completely different books, I think that's something to respect and to keep in mind when we're talking about this, that even though it seems like they might be inspired, this book at the end of the day is separate from the fanfiction that got Knightley a really good audience on AO3. All of that to say that this book is actually pretty separate from the Harry Potter universe. The author is not. The author has been able to gain a following and gain this sort of support from being a fanfiction author online for specifically Dramione fanfiction. But the author has not decided to bring that into their work as a traditionally published author, and instead has decided to create their own original story that is not based off of their fanfic, and has decided to create something completely independent of that and put out a story into the world that they feel is separate from the Harry Potter universe, which is partly why it's one of my favorites, because it's just completely new material, and it was just so exciting to read and just see what Bridget Knightley could accomplish here. As this, like, again, with this being like their debut novel, I think it's amazing that this is the sort of work that they were able to put out. And again, keeping in mind that this is work that they were able to put out that wasn't a rewrite of a work that they had already spent years on refining and writing and planning. Instead, this is a whole new piece of work that they've come out with that I think really helps them stand in their own sort of category and really stand on their own 2 feet as a published author. So these are things that I want to keep in mind when we're talking about specifically this book. That, I think, kind of sums up my thoughts on The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy, because I do really think that it is kind of in a league of its own when it comes to a lot of these traditionally published books from fanfic authors. The second book that I want to discuss is Rose in Chains by Julie Soto. Now, this is the only book where I haven't actually read the original fanfiction, and the original fanfiction, I believe, was called The Auction. I got into Dramione a little bit too late to read this book, and I just never ended up looking hard enough for it. But I do believe that this is a direct rewrite of the fanfiction, because again, it was taken off of AO3, and usually authors only take it off of AO3 if the published version is going to be the same story, and so they don't want you being able to get the same story for free online, because it's probably just built into their publishing contract, because that doesn't really make sense that you would have the same story up for free and then people being able to buy it. People are obviously going to go for the free version. I do have a physical copy, I just don't have it on me right now, so imagine that it's right here. Rose in Chains is set in Evermore, and it follows the kingdom's princess, Bryony, as they kind of lose the war and have to deal with being prisoners of war and everything that kind of happens after. So she's taken captive with a lot of the other women in her kingdom and in her palace, and her friends and her school friends and all that sort of stuff. She's eventually put up for sale at an auction that is just being held by the side that won this war. At the end of that auction, she finds out that she was actually bought by her high school crush. Yes, crush. Tovin, who is the son of one of the most influential families of the Bomardi kingdom, which is the kingdom that fought against them to eventually win this war. However, once she actually starts living with Tovin, she finds out that him and his entire family are kind of more on her side, and they're actually trying to help her, and they're actually not as mean to her as a lot of the other owners are of the other women that were sold at that auction. And so together they try to find ways to save or to help or to protect other women who were sold, and just to try to kind of help the remaining people of Evermore that they know. And obviously during all of this, Tovin and Bryony fall in love, and you kind of have flashbacks to their time when they were in school together and them now, and kind of how they always had a bit of a thing going. But anyway, so as you can see, there is very much a sense of inspiration that's taken from the Harry Potter universe, and it's very clear to see that. Again, because this is a rewrite of the original fanfiction, it is very clear to see the inspiration from Harry Potter that's in this book. It's really, really hard to step out of that mindset in a way, because again, when you have the flashbacks, a lot of it is, well, it's like to boarding school, flashbacks to like dances that they have, to how they were kind of on opposite sides of their thinking and their reasoning and their beliefs and all this sort of stuff. And you can definitely like map the characters onto that different Harry Potter characters, right? You can be like, oh, that one's Harry, that one's Ron, that one's, you know, Seamus Finnegan. It's very clear to see how this is a rewrite of a fanfiction and how this fanfiction was a Harry Potter fanfiction. So this is where I want to note that this book is a little bit unique, because this is not the first book that the author has published. This was just one of, I think, one of their most popular fanfic works. And so when they rewrote this and they published it, marketing was very focused on the fact that this person was a fanfic author who was now publishing this rewritten version of one of their very famous fanfics. Julie Soto has published at least a couple of books before she published Rose and Chains. I haven't read any of her previous books, so I just kind of did a few quick searches just trying to see what these other books were. It seems like two of her other books were loosely inspired by Reylo fanfics that she had written, which, if you aren't familiar, is Rey and Kylo Ren from the most recent Star Wars trilogy. And that's obviously a very famous famous pairing, and where quite a few authors actually kind of got their start. Like Ali Hazelwood, a lot of her books are based off of her Reylo pairing, and so her characters are kind of similar to Kylo and Rey, so it's a popular ship for a lot of current authors that started as fanfic authors. But what I found interesting was that these two previous books that were pretty popular, and again based on Goodreads, had quite a few reviews, and were obviously books that people were reading, these were not advertised as being based on fanfic, even though one of them, again from just my Googling, it seemed like one of them was heavily inspired by one of her Reylo fanfics. Those weren't advertised as fanfiction, and she wasn't advertised as a fanfiction author before she published Rose and Chains. So even though she published two books and she got her start from fanfic writing, she never actually got advertised or marketed as a fanfic author until she published Rose and Chains, amidst all of these publishers signing book deals for quite a few Dramione fanfic rewritings. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that this was a very unique case. This is the only author who has been published prior to their Dramione fanfic rewrite. To me, that seemed really interesting, and I think as of right now, it seems to just sort of be a trend that publishing houses are kind of hopping on to publish Dramione fanfics specifically, because it really, really took off like a couple of years ago, and people just started publishing these authors, and now the best way for them to get marketing around that was to market them as fanfic authors, whereas previously people didn't really talk about their fanfic origins, right? Like, you wouldn't really say that, oh yeah, I started off as a fanfic author, because people were less likely to take you seriously. I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to note that. I don't want to get too much into that right now, because I'll get into that when I'm like wrapping up the video. But right now I want to focus on this book, Rose and Chains, specifically. To me, this is where this pipeline of fanfic to trad pub gets a little dicey. I can appreciate a good author who gets published because they were able to write really good fanfic, right? And I am all for fanfic authors getting their recognition, getting their day, and being able to publish and actually make money off of the work that they put up for free on fanfic websites, right? Because a lot of times these authors are really, really, really good authors, and they have a really good grasp on storytelling and narratives and developments and, you know, character arcs and character developments. And I love how rich a lot of fanfic stories are, right? And so I am 100% all for fanfic authors having the ability to traditionally publish books, be them inspired by their fanfic or new books entirely, but I'm all for them leveraging the audience that they were able to create with their fanfic works. But I think that these authors should be published if they're able to actually create a book that stands on its own 2 feet when you separate it from the fan fiction, or when you separate it from the world that they used to write fan fiction in. And that's where I think this book, specifically Rose in Chains, fails. I think that if an author who has, up until the point of them writing a manuscript to get traditionally published, has never been traditionally published and has only written fanfic, I think that if that author cannot deliver a book that is sound in terms of plot, in terms of characters, in terms of story development, in terms of world building and all that sort of stuff that counts with actually having to create a brand new book and a brand new world, especially in fantasy. I think that if an author is not able to deliver that, they should not be published. Like, if you are saying that, yeah, you got your great start in fanfic and that's amazing, and then you try to write this fantasy world that is very poorly written, there's basically no world building, and it tends to rely a little bit too heavily on hoping that people map this onto the original work that it was based off of and kind of fill in the plot holes themselves. I don't think that's good writing, and I don't think that's a book that should be published. And I think that just ends up becoming a bad book. And that's where I kind of have a problem with this pipeline, because then a lot of people chalk that up to being that fanfic writers can't write good books. Whereas you can have authors that rely really heavily on a lot of the work that was done to set up characters and to set up backgrounds in the Harry Potter universe, and they end up not really being able to create their own world when they have to traditionally publish their books and then create a world that actually stands on its own. And so where this comes up in specifically Rose in Chains is to do with the actual, kind of with everything, with the world building, with the character development, with the progression of the story. I think a lot of it relies on the historical context that the author had in the fanfiction from the Harry Potter universe. When we're looking at Rose in Chains, to me, it felt like there was just not enough context given to truly understand who these characters were and what they were doing and what was at stake. Because I have read so many Dramione fanfics, and because I have read the Harry Potter books, it was easy for me to map those concepts onto this book and say, okay, I understand that you're referencing the Battle of Hogwarts, and so I can fill in the blanks of what isn't really given to me to understand that these atrocious things probably happened, and to understand that this is probably how these two characters feel about each other, and that this is probably how she thought about this person and how she thought about that person, and how these relationships affected her and all this sort of stuff. I was able to fill in the blanks because I had to, and because I had knowledge on how a lot of these other fanfics worked, even though I hadn't read the original fanfic by Julie Soto. For me, we kind of get really, really patchy world building. We have some sort of information about what these kingdoms looked like and what Evermore and Bomardi kind of looked like, but we don't really get solid information on either of them. We kind of get really introductory, really high level information about these two kingdoms that just isn't enough to actually immerse you in the world, right? And to actually immerse you in what this sort of kingdom looks like and why it's so awful that this kingdom was destroyed and why the Bomardi are bad and evil. You also don't really understand who Tovin is through this entire book, and that was one of my biggest issues with this book, was Tovin was kind of just left to the side. Like, we don't learn much about him. It's pretty high level again. It's pretty patchwork. It's pretty bad, right? Like, we don't actually get a ton of information about who Tovin really is. We don't get information about how his upbringing really affects him. We don't get information about how he truly feels about this war and where he feels his place is in this war. And we also don't really understand why him or Bryony didn't really act on their feelings towards each other in high school, because you see a lot of flashbacks to their time in school, in their boarding school, and how it always seemed like there was something between them. And there were like moments where, you know, they'd look back on and he protected her and he would make sure that people didn't say awful things about her or whatever it was. And so you kind of have this really weird sense of, well, if it seems like they got along, I don't understand what was stopping them from being together, because there wasn't a ton of context that was given to us on that. And so you sort of have this sense throughout the entire story that Tovin is trying to redeem himself, that he's trying to show Bryony that he's changed and that he's better than who he was before, or whatever it is. But I don't truly understand who he was before, and I don't really understand what he's really redeeming himself for. And I don't quite get the sense that Bryony holds that against him. Like, I don't think that Bryony actually hasn't forgiven him yet. There was this really weird sense of like the author trying to create forced tension between these two characters, but there ended up being not a lot between these two characters because we didn't really know who they were at the end of the day. Like, I didn't truly understand who Bryony was, and I didn't truly understand who Tovin was either. And to me, I think this is the part where most fanfic rewrites can either make it or break it when it comes to traditionally publishing. The relationships between characters are so important to any book, of course, but when it comes to rewriting a fanfic, it becomes even harder, because when you're writing a fanfic, you write with a ton of context and a ton of history already in place, right? So when you're writing, for example, a Dramione fanfiction, you already have a very strong sense of who Draco Malfoy is and who Hermione Granger is. You have really, really strong historical context on these two characters. You have 7 books worth of information that is the original source material, right? So as a fanfic author, you don't actually have to build that up, right? You don't have to build up 7 years worth of information of these two characters, or relationships of these two characters, or dynamics of these two characters. What you need to do is take what's relevant and then twist it to fit your narrative, and then you get to create this really great story because people already know the context of these characters. A lot of times when you're reading these books where, you know, Draco redeems himself, it's really easy to focus on the redemption arc because you don't need to set up all of the awful things he did for 7 years, right? Readers already know that coming into the book. So you don't have to actually create this sort of tension, this sort of hatred, this sort of opposition between him and Hermione, because readers already know what that is. Readers already know why they don't get along, and why, when it comes to Malfoy redeeming himself, it's going to take a lot of work because the things that he did were absolutely awful. But there's that context that's already in place. Authors don't have to create that context. But when you're trying to rewrite this fanfic that's based off of all of this really, really strong, rich context that is from its source material, as an author, you now have to create that sort of rich material in a completely new book. Unfortunately, I think that's where this book just ended up falling short, right? Was it relied on people having context around what these characters had and the sort of relationships that they had, and then it ended up just falling short in the actual rewritten version of it because the author wasn't able to create that sort of backstory for these characters. At its core, this book ended up being a really bad rewrite because it couldn't actually separate itself from the original source work, and it couldn't actually separate itself from the fanfic that it was based off of, right? And when it's not able to do that, and it's not able to separate itself from its original work and from its source work, that's the sign of a badly published book, especially if it's a rewrite of a fanfic. And I think unfortunately that's the case of this pipeline, right? Is that a lot of times when you're thinking about what's expected of authors, it might seem like there's almost more pressure that's put on fanfic authors because they almost really have to prove themselves as a writer. But I sort of think that's natural for every single writer, right? Like, if you publish a book and it's lacking in world building, it's lacking in relationships, it's lacking in character development, that is the sign of a badly written book, right? And I would sort of hold out criticism for any author who published a book and any author who got a publishing deal from a massive publisher to write a book that ends up being pretty lazily written and kind of has a lot of glaring plot holes, right? But I think unfortunately what happens is we kind of blame this on fanfiction writers, which is valid to a certain extent. If you're getting this publishing deal to write an original piece of fiction and you're using your fanfiction as the base of your work, you really need to do a ton of work to transform that work into something that stands on its own and something that's separate from the source work or separate from the fanfiction. And then you have to actually create backstory and you have to create world building around the story that you've written so that it actually makes sense and exists within a world and doesn't exist in a world where you don't actually have to provide readers with background because they already have it, right? So you sort of have to do the work of both creating an original source work and creating a fanfiction version of that source work, putting it together and creating an original story. You've got a story like The Auction that's based off of this Harry Potter world, and now you have to go in and actually create the source work in which a story like The Auction can exist by itself that is separate from Harry Potter. When that job isn't done well, it creates for badly written books. And unfortunately, I think because we have so much scrutiny right now on this fanfiction to Tradpub pipeline, specifically within the Dramione world and specifically with a lot of the problematic nature of being tied to or being associated with Harry Potter and the original work of Harry Potter, it's kind of hard because I think they're under a lot more scrutiny than usual than a lot of other authors have, where if you're an author who writes a badly written book, then you just become an author who writes a badly written book. But if you're a fanfic author who writes a badly written book, then you become a shitty fanfic author who can't do anything but write fanfic. And I think that's kind of unfair. That's I think a little unfortunate and a little sad that that's how we treat fanfic authors who are still trying to hone their craft and still trying to understand how to create stories that aren't taking from source materials, because it is two completely different ways of looking at books and looking at stories and creating and writing, right? All of that to say that I think unfortunately this book was a victim of the fanfic to Tradpub pipeline and unfortunately is not good representation for this. To me at least, I know a lot of people loved this book and a lot of people were really raving about it on like Goodreads and people loved it. I did not. I had a really hard time getting into this book and getting invested in this book, and I don't think I'm gonna read the sequel when it comes out because I think this is part of a trilogy. I don't think I'm going to read it. It's not something that really pulled me in, and hopefully there's more context and more story that's given over the next two books, but I just think that this book unfortunately wasn't able to accomplish what I would hope a fanfic author would be able to. But this actually provides a perfect little segue into our next book, which is Alchemised. Now, Alchemised, like Rose and Chains, is a rewrite of a fanfic that was on Archive of Our Own, which is now taken off. So this is based off of the fanfic Manacled. You can tell by the one word name that obviously Sunlin Yu still took a ton of inspiration. They also used their tag, so this is the actual account name that wrote the book Manacled, and they kept that tag as their author name in the exact same format, in one word, Sunlin Yu. Found that interesting. But anyways, I have read Manacled, so I have read the fanfic that this is based off of, and I have read Alchemized. The world of Manacled is basically an alternate ending to the Harry Potter book, to the Deathly Hallows, where Harry does end up dying in the Battle of Hogwarts, and Voldemort actually does end up killing him. The dark side wins, and we're basically looking at what the world becomes after. Manacled is a bit of a mix in terms of fanfic, because it's inspired by Harry Potter and it's inspired by The Handmaid's Tale. So you have both of those elements coming in to create kind of joint fanfic. In Manacled, we follow Hermione, who is the main character here. She ends up getting put in this like prison of sorts. Over the time that she's in that prison, she really works on her occlumency. I always struggle to pronounce that word. And she basically builds up these barriers in her brain that kind of shut out the last 2 years of her life and completely barricade them, so nobody can get through and nobody can break through and actually retrieve those memories. She can't even remember them herself. That's how hard she's worked on her occlumency. And when she's taken out of this prison and they realize that she has these memories that she's hid and she's locked away, Voldemort decides to send her to his right hand, the High Reeve, who is the best at legilimency in the Wizarding World as of right now. And so she goes over to the High Reeve's house and she's like, oh my god, wait a second, you're Draco Malfoy. And he's like, haha, I am. So he has to try to break her mind and has to try to break in and get those memories no matter what happens to provide them to Voldemort. But while she's there, they end up creating this program where they want to repopulate the Wizarding World because people just aren't having kids anymore. People just aren't able to have kids anymore. And I'm pretty sure there was something about the blood curse that comes in here with the purebloods. So they're like, we gotta start making kids. Like, we have to start this basically similar to The Handmaid's Tale, where you would have a wife, but then you'd have a handmaid who's the person who's giving birth to your baby. And then you just take that baby and that baby becomes yours. So that was the goal of this rebirthing or like repopulation program, and Hermione kind of gets put into that. The story kind of follows that for a while, and then eventually there comes a point where Hermione does end up getting her memories back, and there's kind of like this explosion of her memories, and we then cut into the 2 years where she erased her memories, and that is before the Battle of Hogwarts and before Harry dies. And so those 2 years cover her time in the Order of the Phoenix and all of the sort of work that she did for the war, and you find out that she actually ends up doing a ton more than what people thought she did or what she was remembered for. And in those 2 years you find out a ton of information about her and about the Order of the Phoenix and about the dark side and about the Death Eaters and about Malfoy. And then the third part of the book is what happens after she retrieves her memories and she's kind of back in the present and everything that she has to do to basically escape. That's an overview of the plot of Manacled. I can't really give much more context because a lot of it is basically spoilers because the book is so heavily reliant on the memories that she loses that everything is a spoiler about most of the book, because the whole point is that you find out all of the memories that she's lost, and it kind of changes the way that you see the first part of the book. And so I can't really give you any of that information because it would basically ruin the book for you. This was a great read. I loved this fanfic. Obviously, I think because I read the fanfic and I already knew the progression of the story, Alchemised was a little bit less of like a shock to me because I already knew where it was going. But Alchemised basically follows the exact same plot, except obviously the characters are different and the factions are different and all that kind of stuff. The plot of Alchemized is basically exactly the same. Like, the actual underlying plot is the same, but there are a lot of differences that I think are really hard to get into because they're very, very technical and they're very specific, and it would require a ton of like explaining. But if we're looking at the actual plot, it's the same. You have our main character Helena, who is part of the Holdfast Empire. Like, she's on the side of the Order of the Eternal Flame, which is like the light side of this war. She ends up being taken captive after the dark side of the war, or kind of the necromancers end up winning, and she is put into a magically induced coma. And when she's brought out, people are like, oh my god, wait a second, that's the Helena from the Order of the Eternal Flame. Like, she was best friends with Luke, who was the leader of the Holdfast, who ended up getting killed. And so they were like, oh my god, like, we have to find out what she knows because she could know valuable information. And they realized that she's basically blocked off 2 years worth of her memories that were during the war. And they were like, the war is over, why are you still protecting this? And she's like, guys, I don't know these memories either. I don't know why. And so they end up sending her to the High Reeve again, who ends up being Kane Ferrin, who is someone who she went to school with. And so she knows him and she's like, oh my god, what the heck are you doing here? But she doesn't really know him because they weren't really like close or anything. They didn't really talk a lot, but she knows quite a bit about the Ferrin family because they're quite a large influential family on the kind of necromancer side or the dark side of this whole war. He ends up having to try to break her and having to try to break into her mind, and again, do it at whatever cost it takes. And similar to Manacled, there's also this sort of like repopulation program that gets put into place, but it's a little different. It's a little technically different because it's about the sort of magical ability that they have, as opposed to them not really being able to reproduce anymore. It's more about they want to have strong heirs to the families, and so they start using people who have really good resonance, which is the type of magic that they have in this world, because it's alchemy that they have. And so resonance with different metals is what's really important here. And so they kind of end up just being like, oh yeah, Helena can just be with Cain because she's got like a great resonance. So whatever. Similar to the plot of Manacled, you have this point at which Helena ends up getting all of her memories back, and we kind of go into this time jump, and we kind of go into these flashbacks of these 2 years of memories that she basically lost. And again, during those memories, you find out a lot more about Helena. You find out a lot more about Luke, who is the leader of the Holdfasts, which is the empire that is that's the light side again. And you find out a lot about Cain, Farron, and kind of their relationship. You find out a lot about the dark side, which is led by Morrow, and so you find out a lot more about how they actually work, what they actually do, how necromancy actually works, and all this kind of stuff. And then the third part of the book is her coming back to the present with all of her memories intact now, and then trying to escape from her reality and from Morrow. Again, very similar structure. I wouldn't even say similar, it's the same structure, it's the same plot line, it's the same progression of the story, and it is literally like you will have chunks of word for word paragraphs or dialogue or scenes that are pulled from Manacled into Alchemized. So it is quite literally just a rewrite of Manacled. But I will say that even though these two books are basically like, they're just sibling books, right? Like they are the exact same in terms of plot and in terms of progression, in terms of character development and all that kind of stuff, they still manage to stand out as two separate books because of the sort of work and effort that Sun Yu put into creating the world around Alchemized, to the point where I prefer Alchemized over Manacled. Like, I don't think that I could go back to Manacled and read it and enjoy it the same way that I enjoyed Alchemized, because I felt like it was so much richer, because there was so much context that was put into Alchemized, to the point where I felt like the sort of messaging and the story and the delivery of these messages that get put in through the story of Alchemized are monumentally better than what you get from Manacled, which is based off of Harry Potter. There's just so much more storytelling that Sun Yu manages to incorporate in Alchemized that to me was mind-blowing, because when I read the book, I don't know, I did not expect it to be that rich. Now when I read the book, I was literally like, oh my god, like I cannot actually believe the level of detail that Sun Yu has gone into in this book, that like I was not expecting it to ever compare to Manacled. Like I truly did not think I could ever experience the sort of emotions I had when I read Manacled for the first time. And then I read Alchemized and I was like, this has been elevated. Like I genuinely do not think I'll ever be able to experience a book like this again. And it was so well done. And just, I know that opinions and thoughts on Alchemized are very divided online. I fall into the category of absolutely loving Alchemized. Like I think it is such a good book. And the reason for that is because Sun Yu does a really good job of adding context to the book and adding a great new world for this book or this story to flourish in a way that even though they have the same plot lines and the same story development and the same progression, they tell completely different stories. The way that Sun Yu has created context means that something that would have created a little bit of impact in Manacled actually packs a really good punch in Alchemized, because there's a ton more context that you don't really have in like the original source work of Harry Potter. Like it isn't as political and as radicalized as Alchemized is, which I think Sun Yu was really able to put that into the book really well. Like I said, it's kind of hard to talk about these differences without explaining all of them in minute detail, so you're gonna have to bear with me here a little bit. I'm gonna try to put a little bit more context to things, but I think it's gonna be really hard because this would end up taking forever if I were to really go into detail about how different Alchemized is from Manacled and why I think it makes such a good impact. But we can start with some really base level, high level kind of things, right? The kingdoms that are put into place in Alchemised are vastly different from the world that Harry Potter is based in. Here, it's a completely fantastical world, and so you have Palladia as this really booming nation where everyone kind of goes if you want to have an education in magic. You have like the Alchemy Institute where Helena ends up going, and that is really, really prestigious, okay? And it's like, for her to get into this institute was a massive thing, and for her to, you know, continue studying and to carry on and to become friends with Luke Holdfast, who was the successor to the throne of the Holdfast Empire. All of that packs a really good punch in Alchemised, because Helena is very obviously a racialized person. She is very obviously an outsider. She has a different accent, she has different hair, she has a different style of talking, she has a lot more hand movements than other people do. And so there are a lot of rules, there are a lot of customs, a lot of just ways of existing that she doesn't quite understand as different from her hometown or from her home kingdom, and coming here to Palladia. And so it's really hard for her to fit in and to be seen as someone who's part of the group. And because of that, she's always been an outsider, and Luke is sort of her only friend. And all of this is really important because it ends up being the reason why she becomes really susceptible to being mistreated and misused by people, and to eventually become almost like a pawn in the war. And again, I don't want to give too much of that because I think it's really important in terms of the story. So you get a lot of really rich context from Helena's experience of the world, and you really get to understand and really empathize with her as a character who is constantly on the outside and is never quite given the same level of love or importance or inclusion as any other character is. And instantly that makes her a very emotional character, and a character that I think a lot of people can relate to and empathize with. I think that Sun Lin Yu was just able to create such good commentary around that and create this really strong social commentary through this book that I think was really impressive, and it's not something that a lot of authors can do, especially when you're trying to rewrite a fanfic that's really heavily inspired by two different types, like two different source materials that are very rich in nature. I think that Alchemised is a really good example of how you can take a rewrite of a fanfiction and make it something completely separate. How you can take these two very linked pieces of work and still actually make them stand on their own 2 feet and have two completely different feelings when you're reading these two works of art. When I read Manacled, I think there's a completely different feeling that you have from that book because it's so focused on the source work of Harry Potter. And when you read Alchemised, it's just in its own world, it has such a massive impact. But that impact is so completely different from the impact that Manacled has, because in Alchemised there's a completely different context around these events that are happening and around these behaviors and these plot lines and these character arcs and developments and decisions, right? It holds a completely different weight than it does in Manacled. And Manacled is much more of like an emotional roller coaster, and it is a wild read, but Alchemised becomes so much more because of the world that it is built in, that it becomes much more of like a think piece. It becomes much more of a critical lens with which to understand the world around us and to understand how all of these different ideas of racism and classism and isolation and war and the politics behind war, how all of these are present in our current world, and how we can understand the world around us and understand that these things are not as clean cut as they might be. And because of the way that Sun Lin Yu was able to create this world in which Alchemised can stand on its own 2 feet, even though it literally has paragraph for paragraphs pulled from Manacled, it is a completely different work. Like, I cannot quite see these two as being the same anymore. To me, Manacled and Alchemised live in two completely different worlds, and they both carry two completely different types of emotions and feelings and experiences for me. Honestly, I was absolutely mind-boggled at how well Sun Lin Yu was able to create a whole new world for Alchemised to live in while still maintaining the heart of Manacled. And I think that was done so beautifully and so brilliantly. And I think Alchemised is a perfect example of how you can do a really, really good transition from fanfic to traditionally published while creating a rewrite of your fanfic. This is an example of a winner of this pipeline. It's the perfect example of using the story, using the type of emotions, the type of reaction, the type of experience that got you really, really, really popular on you know, fanfiction websites, to be able to create and elicit that same sort of reaction in new readers for the first time, but to create a completely different reaction to readers who have already read your work and are still able to have a completely unique, completely different experience. Again, I know that it's very polarizing. I know that people have completely differing opinions on Alchemised online. Some people hate it, some people love it. I don't really think there's an in-between with this book, but I think that this is a really, really good example of where this pipeline can really benefit authors and can really, really create this just like amazing opportunity for them to publish their work traditionally, finally get paid and compensated for the sort of work that they put into creating, you know, 1,000-page fan fiction. I think it's amazing that they're able to get paid for doing this now. They're able to find new audiences who would never read a Dramione fanfic but would read a traditionally published book inspired by Dramione. I think it's great. I think it's amazing. I think this is a great example. And if you haven't already been able to tell, I really, really love Alchemised. So obviously this is very subjective, but to me, I feel like this is where this pipeline can really, really benefit authors. And I think it's kind of ridiculous for us to say that fanfic authors don't deserve that opportunity to become traditionally published, because we have some books that are poorly written, and I think that this is where this pipeline actually really, really helps authors. All right, guys, we are almost there, almost at the end. There is one more book that I want to talk about. This book is called Once Again Always by Amanda Gale. I only have it on my e-reader, so this is the best I can do to offer you a cover of it. I am really, really lucky and super thankful that I was able to actually receive an ARC of this book from NetGalley. An ARC might be changed before it's actually published, so the version that I read might end up being different from the book that actually gets published, but I still wanted to talk about this book because it is a highly, highly anticipated rewrite of another very, very popular Dramione fanfiction called Wait and Hope, which has recently been taken off of Archive of Our Own. I did read Wait and Hope before it was taken off, so the plot of Wait and Hope and the plot of Once Again Always are the exact same because it's just a rewrite. It's set after the last book of Harry Potter, Wait and Hope that is, and Hermione ends up just waking up in the hospital and she has to like answer a few questions because people are like, hey, you might have memory loss, let's answer these questions. You know, what year is it? When were you born? What's your name? Or whatever the questions were, before they're able to tell her whether she got the questions right or not. Draco Malfoy comes storming into the room and he's like, tell me what's going on with my wife. And Hermione's like, what is going on? And Harry's in the room with her and she's like, what is going on? Why is he screaming about his wife? And Harry's like, you got a few of those questions wrong, and one of them was your name. Your name is actually Hermione Granger Malfoy. So obviously she's married to Draco Malfoy. I don't really remember exactly the time frame of her memories that she loses, but it's quite a bit of time. And she ends up being like, there's no way I'd ever fall in love with Draco. Like, this is wild. This seems really weird. And she really doesn't want to like try to rekindle this. But Ginny and Harry are kind of like, trust us, you know, you really, really love him. You guys really get along. We encourage you to, you know, just spend some time with him, live with him, and see if you can make this work and see if you can get your memories back. Hopefully everything works out great. And so she kind of does that. And so over the course of the book, it's basically her trying to regain her memories. And she does that by, you know, one, trying to find like cures and stuff and trying to see if there's anything that can help her with her memory loss. But she's also learning more about her life, right? She's learning more about Malfoy. She's learning more about the sort of life that they built together. And she's learning more about his friends, who ends up she's really good friends with as well. And so, you know, she's trying to like make sense of this situation that she's been put in, all while she's, you know, trying to regain her memories, but also realizing that she's kind of falling in love with Draco, and she kind of sees how that probably happened, all while Draco is like, you know, struggling because he's like, this is literally my wife, and like, you don't even love me anymore. And it's really hard because his life obviously changed when he got back in touch with Hermione and they were able to reconcile and you know, kind of fall in love. And to him, like, you know, he's lost his wife, and it's like really, really hard for him. You get this really, really great fanfic that is beautiful, and like I absolutely loved Wait and Hope. And so I do want to preface my review of the book with saying that I loved the fan fiction. Like, it was easily one of my top fanfics that I had read of Dramione. It was so beautifully written. I don't know, I thought that it was really, really simple because it really just focused on their relationship. You know, it's not like a dark fanfic. Their relationship was really great. I think Hermione and Draco's characterizations were done really, really well. And I loved how there was all this information that you were getting. But again, it ended up being a really, really rich fanfic because there was so much context that you had from the Harry Potter world, right? Like, there was a lot of information that you got about how they were able to reconcile the sort of, you know, insults that he would say to her, or the sort of way that he treated her when they were in school. Obviously them being on two separate sides of the war, right? All these awful things that he did, being a Death Eater, all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot that she ends up changing for him as well in terms of how he views himself, of whether he's worthy of forgiveness or not, right? Of whether he should be viewed as worthy of being back in society again, whether other people can forgive him. And she ended up becoming a rock to him for that, right? And you can see all of that through the fanfic in Wait and Hope. And again, that becomes really impactful because you know the source material. The Once Again Always plot is very similar, and it literally follows the exact same plot line, just that they're not magical. So you just have the two main characters, Molly, who is Hermione, and Aster, who is Malfoy. And so it's basically them in a relationship, and Molly waking up with all of her memories gone for the past like 6 years or so, and her being like, what do you mean I would marry my arch nemesis from school? And that's kind of where you get their background. And her best friends are like, no, trust me, you love him, and all that kind of stuff, and it follows the exact same plot. So it's kind of just like a romance book. It's not really like a fantasy book or anything. Like I said, I really, really, really loved Wait and Hope, which is why I really struggled with Once Again Always. It's really unfortunate because to me, it seemed like Wait and Hope would be the easiest book to make a rewrite, right? Because it isn't magical in nature. It doesn't really focus on the magic of Harry Potter. It doesn't quite focus on a war, or it doesn't seem to focus on the source material. It seems like it would be easier to create a really good, convincing storyline for two characters who hated each other to eventually end up marrying each other, and for the story to basically be an exploration of their relationship and how they ended up getting to where they were, to the point where they got married, right? It seems pretty simple and pretty straightforward, and so I thought it was just going to be a really nice romance book. It has all the perfect ingredients of like a really, really great, just like rom-com kind of beautiful romance story, right? And it seems straightforward enough that it should be pretty easy for the author to be able to put this together and create a really rich, beautiful, loving story. To me, it just did not hit the way I wanted it to. Like, and I'm so disappointed to say this because again, I was so looking forward to this book. Like, I really, really thought it was going to be just like such a good rewrite of this book, and it just didn't do justice. I think the main thing here was that while Wait and Hope isn't focused on the magic of Harry Potter, it really, really relies on having context around Draco and Hermione's relationship. I think I underestimated the importance of that context when I thought about, you know, the fact that this is going to be a rewrite. What I mean by that is, when you look at Wait and Hope, a lot of the character arcs or the development that both Hermione and Draco go through are really important as a reader because you understand what their history was that again was given to you from, you know, 7 books worth of source material and information. This is something that really, really stuck out to me, which I think was a main point of contention for me. This is a bit of a spoiler, I guess. It doesn't really affect this outcome of the story, but it seems to be like a pretty crucial plot point because it says a lot about their relationship, I think. But in Wait and Hope, you find out that Draco is applying for a position at Hogwarts as a teacher. I think it's Defense Against the Dark Arts. I forget which one. But he basically wants to be a professor at Hogwarts. And when Hermione finds this out, like, no memories, Hermione, the Hermione that lost her memories, she's like, you think Hogwarts is going to take you back after everything you've done? Like, why are you even trying this? Why are you even trying to apply to Hogwarts when like you were literally a Death Eater? Like who's gonna let you in? And you see very clearly that that moment really, really affects Draco. And you don't quite understand why in that moment, but you find out later that it was Hermione who was the person who encouraged him to apply for that position. And she was kind of doing a ton of work on the back end with McGonagall to get her to accept Draco and to, you know, let him become a professor at Hogwarts and basically like pleading for his case. So she was the main person who was encouraging him to do this. Through that one simple detail, you understand exactly how much Hermione must have changed her views on Draco to believe that he is worthy of going back into Hogwarts and getting a position there, right? And that he should be able to fight for that and that McGonagall should be able to see that. It tells us a lot in terms of how their relationship has changed because we understand the history that Hermione and Draco and Hogwarts have. We understand why Hogwarts wouldn't really accept Draco into that position. As a reader, I think that's the moment where it really solidifies for you how much Hermione loves Draco and how much, like just how strong and how influential their relationship is in terms of Draco's self-image and his idea of what he's worth. When you have a similar situation like that in Once Again Always, it ends up falling really flat because to me, there just wasn't enough context around what their life was in school and before they ended up like reconciling. And what ended up falling really flat was the fact that there wasn't enough context around their relationship to understand why it's so important that she was encouraging Aster to apply for a position at their old school. So what ended up happening was, one, the reasoning for why they were like rivals was kind of patchworky. It didn't really stick. I think to me, I was just reading it and I was like, this feels really, really forced. Like I don't quite understand why they hate each other. Like it was just a very simple, you know, oh, she was a scholarship kid and he was a rich kid. And I was like, okay. But like, I don't really see how they interact with each other. Like, I don't really see why they really, really hated each other or how they hated each other. You don't really see a lot of that and you don't really find out a lot about that. You also don't really find out about why it's so hard for Aster to get back into the good side of his school. There's like a whole scandal that happens in the school that is kind of like the culmination of their hatred for each other. And it's something like, I think he accuses her of plagiarism and then she accuses him of like cheating or something like that. And that ends up being like a really, really big deal to the school, which I understand, yeah, that's like a big deal, but they also both withdrew their complaints about each other. So to me, I wasn't quite sure why that ended up leaving such a bad stain on like his reputation with the school, because it seemed to me like from the information that we got, Molly was very upfront with the school that that wasn't true, or that she was like, actually, I don't want to make this complaint anymore. So to me, it should have been pretty clear that he didn't do that. So I'm not entirely sure why he had such a hard time getting back into the school. The other thing is I don't quite understand why he was so like hell-bent on getting into the school that he went to. I understand why it makes sense for Hogwarts because like it's the only like wizarding school that's close by for them or whatever, or they have a history with Hogwarts, and like when you're understanding what their relationship was to Hogwarts, it's much more than just an educational institute for them. Maybe it's the same for boarding school, but I didn't quite understand why he was so attached to the school to the point where he felt like that was the only place that he could get a job. I thought that was really, really interesting because it just wasn't fleshed out. Like there just wasn't any context around it, and there wasn't an understanding of why these moments in Aster and Molly's relationship were pivotal to how they viewed themselves and how they viewed each other in their relationship. And so there was a lot like these little moments that just ended up falling flat because there wasn't a lot of context around how they interacted before they, you know, started dating and when they were kids, and how they behaved now that they were together. So to me, without all of the context that we got from the Harry Potter universe, this book ended up feeling really, really, really flat because there wasn't context that was given to us within the book itself. There were like alternating flashback chapters to what they were like in school, but these chapters were like really, really, really short and gave us almost zero information. Like there was literally a chapter that was just like Molly being in the library and like finding Aster in the library and then like staring at him until he woke up, and then like she ran away, and like that was the whole chapter. And I was like, what? Like, I have learned nothing about these two characters from this interaction. Like, this isn't enough for me to understand what they were like in school. Like, this isn't enough for me to understand why it's so wild that they're in a relationship together. That's what I mean, right? It's like the whole crux of the book was that Molly was like, I would never date Aster. And I'm like, why? Why would you not? I don't see why you wouldn't. Because he didn't, like, it didn't seem like he had done anything wild enough to warrant this sort of hatred for Molly. Like, hatred to the point where she literally could not see herself in any reality somehow having feelings for this man. It just didn't seem that serious. You know what I mean? Whereas, again, in Harry Potter, you truly understand why Hermione would never see herself with Malfoy. Because he said awful things, he did awful things, and he was an awful person to her. And you see that, and you understand that for her to forgive all of that means that Malfoy had to really, really, really change in order for that to happen. And it had to be something monumental that ended up bringing them together, right? But when you read Once Again Always, it doesn't translate like that. You're just kind of like, here are two people who had a bit of like a childish rivalry when they were in high school, and it doesn't seem like it's serious enough to warrant Molly never being able to see herself with this man and being disgusted by the fact that she's with this man because he's done like unforgivable things to her in the past, and she doesn't understand how she could possibly be with him. What ends up happening is like all of these moments that are meant to be really impactful and that are really impactful in Wait and Hope end up just kind of falling flat in Once Again Always. What I think happened was the author ended up relying too much on the fanfiction to give them the storyline and the plot and the, you know, kind of big finisher of this story, that she wasn't actually able to create context around it, and she wasn't actually able to create a really rich story. Because again, this is one of those books that you're like, this can totally just exist in the real world. It's such an easy transfer, right? Like, it doesn't rely on magic, it doesn't rely on actually creating a whole fantastical world for this story to fit into, so it feels like it should be a lot easier to bring to life in just the normal world. But I just don't think that the author realized the importance of context and the importance of understanding who these characters were before they got together in order for us to understand why it's so important that they did get together and that they did end up supporting each other through some of these really, really life-changing decisions. I don't want to rehash the same, you know, points over and over and over again, but I think for me, the summary of why I was really disappointed with this book was it didn't end up creating the sort of context that it needed. And this was very similar to Rose and Chains, right? Where we just ended up having not enough context around the actual plot lines of this book and what was actually happening with the characters. We didn't have enough characterization of our main characters, that you get to the point where you're filling in the blanks yourself with either information from the fan fiction that you've read or from the original source work of the fan fiction that this book is a rewrite of. So you kind of end up not being able to separate this version of the book from the original source material of the fan fiction that it's based off of. And when that happens, you actually can't really separate these books from Harry Potter, and you really can't actually separate these books from the original universe that it exists in. And that ends up being a really poor reflection of the author's writing abilities, unfortunately. And again, it kind of feeds into this idea of this pipeline of fanfiction to trad pub is actually ruining publishing, and it's ruining the sort of books that we're getting, and it's ruining the sort of standards that we're setting for authors. And I think, unfortunately, this book is another victim of this pipeline, right? That unfortunately, this book just didn't live up to everything that it could have, and it ended up just being a pretty sad kind of shadow of the book that Wait and Hope was, right? That there's a lot of context that you miss. There's a lot of, not even just context around these two characters, but you don't really understand why it's monumental that Molly is best friends with all of Aster's best friends. Whereas in Harry Potter, you understand why it's monumental that, like, Hermione becomes best friends with Pansy Parkinson. You're like, how the hell did that happen, right? To wrap this video up, I really wanted to go over my thoughts on this pipeline altogether. Now that we've kind of examined some of the most popular books that have come out of this pipeline of, you know, Dramione fanfic to trad pub, and just what I think about that pipeline. I think, unfortunately, because there are some badly written books, fanfic authors end up taking the flak for publishing decisions, right? For decisions that are made by publishers to continue and to move forward with publishing a manuscript that isn't as well written as it should be. I don't know how the publishing industry works in terms of like the inside operation, so I'd love if there was someone who had more information on this to provide some context and, you know, leave a comment below and tell me. But to me, I don't know if publishing industries are offering the right sort of support to fanfic authors when they have to transition from fanfic to tradpub. And I think if they're not being offered that support, that is really a failing of publishing industries, because I think it's really, really rude of an industry to pluck someone up from something that they're really, really good at doing and then saying, hey, you know, we want money and you want money, so why don't you just write this traditionally published book and then we'll just publish it for you, and it's up to you to make this a great book, and we're going to offer you zero support, even though we know that we're taking someone who has never published a book before and we're trusting you to be able to create a really good book because you've already written pieces on the internet that are doing really well, without understanding that they're two completely different styles of writing. That if you were to pluck up a nonfiction author and say, hey, we really want you to write a fiction book and we're going to offer you zero support on writing a fiction book, and then we're going to be really mad when you don't sell as many copies as you do as a nonfiction author, that's kind of wild, right? And so I would hope that publishers are keeping that in mind when they're plugging people out of things that they're really, really good at to put them in a completely different environment and expect a completely different polished product from them. I think that's really unfortunate. And I think if that's the case, I really can't fault the authors for at times putting out work that is unfortunately poorly written, but I don't know. I don't know how the industry works, and I don't know whether that's true or not, right? But either way, I think it's unfortunate because there are a lot of fanfic authors that are just like catching strays in this unfortunate debate of whether fanfic authors are worthy of being traditionally published. And I think it's really unfortunate because there's this sense of people still looking down on fanfiction authors, right? You look down on them because you think that they're not creative enough or imaginative enough or good enough to write a book that just exists in its own universe. But a lot of times fanfic authors have different goals and have different ideas of what is creatively satisfying to them, right? A lot of times if you talk to fanfic authors, they're not writing because they've always wanted to create a piece of work, right? A lot of times if people just want to write fiction books, they kind of go to like Wattpad to write fiction books, right? A lot of times people write fan fiction because they're inspired by the source material and because they see a gap in storytelling and they want to fill that gap and they want to tell a different narrative because they feel that it's almost there, it's just never explored, right? For example, the Dramione fanfiction like world right now is really popular for a reason, right? People saw potential in a relationship between Hermione and Draco because they saw potential in them being able to help each other be the best versions of themselves. They were able to see a sort of relationship that the author decided not to pursue, but fanfic authors get inspired by these things that they wish that they could see in a real, you know, piece of fiction, and they decide to create that for themselves. That is a completely different skill that a lot of times traditionally published authors aren't able to do if that's not where they started. So I think it's really unfortunate that we think of fanfiction authors as being lesser than traditionally published authors when in fact they're two different types of skills, right? And I think that unfortunately having this magnifying glass on this pipeline of, you know, fanfic to traditionally published authors means that people will take examples of badly written books and say this is why fanfic authors should never be traditionally published. And it's unfortunate because they should be. They should be given the opportunities to be traditionally published because a lot of them are amazing authors. They just probably need more time and more training to create a book that's at the same level as people who have been traditionally published for years now or for multiple books now, right? I think it's really interesting because before this, people never advertised that they were fanfic writers to start with. Everyone knows about 50 Shades of Grey now, right? It's really popular now that it's Twilight fanfic. When it came out, it was not marketed as Twilight fanfic. people didn't know that it was Twilight fanfic until someone was like, oh my god, I actually think it's based off of Twilight. People were not openly saying that they came from the fanfic world. Now people are using the sort of popularity that comes from either one, having a really popular fanfiction work, or two, having a really popular fanfiction work that's based in a really popular series or a really popular fictional world. But what's also happening is people are talking about fanfiction more openly now. Not super openly, but it's a lot more common for people to just say like, yes, I love Dramione fanfic now. It's much more accepted for people to read specifically Dramione fanfiction, because I won't say that it's the same across everything, right? And I think as we're having more of these discussions around reading fanfiction authors are getting put more into the spotlight, right? So now you have like trending videos of people being like, here are the best 5 Dramione fanfics to read. And so when this stuff is kind of taking off online and these things are being made a trend, right? Then of course publishers are going to pick up on that, right? And if they're going to be like, here's this book that's doing great and everyone's talking about it, why don't we sell it? Why don't we make money off of this that people obviously love? People obviously love reading for free, so why don't we just start selling it to people? It makes sense. I do think too that some of these decisions around who they're publishing isn't being made the way that it should be, right? I think that as of right now, it's kind of like anyone who's created a really popular fanfiction just should be published, should be traditionally published. But I don't think they're understanding that, again, there's a really big difference between writing a fanfic and writing a traditionally published book. And so a lot of times you have these publishers that are saying like, yeah, we're actually gonna, traditionally publish Sun Lin Yu. And now it kind of gets hard to back out of that, even if Sun Lin Yu were to turn in a manuscript that kind of sucks, right? Like, how do you go back from that and say, actually, never mind, we're not publishing Sun Lin Yu, right? Like, how do you do that? Especially keeping in mind that these are people's debut novels. A lot of times, debut novels don't hold this sort of weight that they do, right? Like, as a fanfic author, people are now expecting you to write this really good book, whereas a lot of times when you're a debut novelist, people aren't expecting a really good book. People are expecting you to hone your craft over the course of like 3 or 4 books, right? People realize that it takes time for people to truly write books that become bestsellers. But you're expecting best-selling books as debut novels from a lot of these authors that I think it's just unfair to hold them up to this really wild standard, right? But you're also looking at them with this magnifying glass, right? Of being like, well, if you publish a bad book, it just looks really shitty on every other fanfic author, because somehow you should be able to do a better job than other debut authors, even if those other debut authors have written multiple other books that just never got published. Because at the end of the day, this is still almost all of these authors' first books that they're ever publishing. That is scary. That is different. Publishing through publishing industry is way different than publishing by hitting enter on your laptop and like having this go out into the world, right? I just don't think it's fair to hold people to the same sort of standards when it's a completely different process. Anyways, the point is that over the course of this video, you were probably like, girl, these are all of your opinions. Like, do you have anything to back you up? And the answer to that is no. I don't, because the point of this video is for me to share my opinions. So, this is totally based off of whether I liked a book or not. Whether I felt like a book was a good representation of this pipeline and whether it wasn't. And that's totally fine. That's totally fair. Like I said, if you want videos that are about the legality of things, there are a ton of really good videos on YouTube. If you want videos that talk a bit more about, the problematic nature of Harry Potter being involved with a lot of these marketing strategies, there are tons of videos that you can watch. To me, I just really wanted to examine these books, how they differed from the fanfic that they were based off of, and then really trying to help understand that I think it's just unfortunate that right now a lot of fanfic authors are catching strays for things that aren't their fault. Right? For them trying to just like make money, for them trying to actually capitalize on the effort and the sort of time that it takes to write a fan fiction and trying to actually create a living out of it. And I don't think there's anything bad in that. And I don't think there's anything bad in having your first book kind of be not the best thing you've ever published. But I think it's also unfair to just say that well, this is why all fanfic authors suck. Like, it's unfortunate that Rose in Chains didn't live up to my expectations, or that Once Again Always didn't live up to my expectations, but I don't know that I'd ever be like, you know, this person is literally the worst author in the world. Like, that's unfair to say. I would just say that that's not for me. Unfortunately, those books fell flat for me. If you like them, you enjoyed them, and I'm glad that you did. To me, I just don't know if I'd read another book of theirs unless they came out with something that truly interested me, right? I don't know if I'd read another fanfic rewrite of theirs, but if they were to say that, hey, I'm creating a whole new book and it's original work that isn't based off of one of my previous fanfics, I'd be like, I'll give you a chance. Like, I'll see what you can do now that you've maybe had a couple of other books to publish. I just don't think as of right now that these books gel with me, right? And I don't think that's a bad thing. But I also don't think that that's representative of fanfic authors being shitty authors, because I think they're great authors. I think it takes a ton of work to be able to create this sort of literature and this sort of work. And I think fanfics are always going to hold a special place in my heart. And I think it's unfair for people to be rude to fanfic authors. So don't be rude to fanfic authors, okay? Be nice. They're people too. And they're people that have spent a lot of time creating work for free for people, just for them to be able to express themselves creatively. And I think it's really, really rude if you're rude to them. So anyways, let me know what you think. Have you read any of these books? What are your thoughts on this pipeline? Do you feel like these books lived up to your expectations if you had read the original fanfictions or not? Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe if you would love to see more content like this. It really helps me understand what's doing well with my audiences. Thank you so much for listening to basically my little review and rant of fanfiction, and I will see you soon.